September, can you make it all the way to Maple Valley these days? You want to come down?
I could probably drive down to Maple Valley.
Because
I mean, by September, I'm just recovering from shoulder replacement surgery with this arm, and
a soldier replacement. No, a shoulder replacement.
right.
I'll get my enunciation.
And
right. You ready, Bob?
I should be wearing a sling, but I just get tired of that dang thing.
All right. So, well, Alan, I just appreciate the chance for us to be able to get together and talk about some of your memories about the Milwaukee Road. And here we are in the old school park in beautiful downtown Darrington, Washington, being able to talk about some of this stuff. Now, didn't you grow up in the or somewhat near here? Where did you start
No,
life?
actually, I grew up in the town of Duval.
Duval, okay.
Which is located on the Everett branch, and so that's where I got my love of the Milwaukee Road.
Oh.
The Everett local running through town.
Okay.
Every evening.
Now,
and
what year would this have been?
Well, I first noticed the railroads about 1964, so I was like 14 years old.
Okay.
And I started hanging out in the railroad yards, and one day the train stopped to do some switching.
Yeah.
And I'd already been warned by a Milwaukee Road police guy to stay off railroad property. He caught me down there and told me how dangerous it was, like a sounder train was coming through every 10 minutes to run over me.
And someone's going to try to steal that train.
And the only thing that ran on that line in the daytime was motor cars, speeders. But anyway, I'd been warned to stay off the railroad tracks, but I was still hanging around down there. And so when the train stopped, the engineer motioned me to come up to the engine, and I thought I was going to get chewed out. I figured, you were already warned to stay off this property. And instead, when I got over there, he says, "You want to come up in the cab for a ride?" Because they were setting cars out, so I got the ride up in the cab for 15, 20 minutes while they shuttled back and forth on the passing track to set some cars out.
Okay.
So I thought that was cool. So I got to meet this engineer.
Yeah.
And then I wrote letters to the agent in Everett asking him questions about the cars that went through on the train and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So rather than write a big long letter trying to answer all my questions, he wrote me a letter and said he would come to Duval and pick me up and take me to Everett and give me a day with the railroads in Everett and give me the whole tour. So he did, and he drove me all the way around to all the different industries, the Weyerhaeuser and EA Nord Door Company and all these companies that shipped stuff that went through the town of Duval on the train, and explained all that to me. Then he took me up to the roundhouse, and then the Everett local had come in by then and tied up, and that same engineer that invited me up in the cab was there, so he took me up to his house.
Oh, really?
And he had a live steam railroad in his backyard that he'd built. And of course it was way too much work to fire up the steam engine, but he had a speeder made on a bicycle, and so he let me tour his whole railroad, and he even had a tunnel between his garage and the property line fence, and it had a tunnel marker on it from the tunnel at Noble, just east of Cedar of Maple Valley. There was two tunnels that were daylighted early on, and so this one was off the Landsberg tunnel, tunnel marker and a plate. But anyway, so then when we got done up there, then he hauled me back down to the roundhouse area, and then
Now, where was the roundhouse in Everett?
It was about 4 blocks south of the depot.
Okay.
On McDougal Avenue.
On McDougal.
There's a beer warehouse or something built on the site now, so you'd never find anything. But the switch engine was just going on duty. So then the switch engine engineer was the brother of the engineer that took me up to his house.
Yeah.
So I got to go up in the switch engine and go down with them to the yard, and I rode around in the switcher all day.
Yeah.
While they made up the train and switched the industries and stuff, and then they had to take a transfer over to the Great Northern. So we got to go through the tunnel that goes underneath Everett.
Right.
And over to the Bond Street station, and they set out some cars there and stuff, and then the crew jumped off and ran in and hit the soda machine inside the pasture depot.
Oh, sure, they had a great
themselves
depot.
got each of them a cold soda and come back, and then then the agent showed up with dinner for me. He
Oh.
went to some hamburger place and bought me some burger and fries and stuff. And the engineer that took me to his house asked me how I was going to get home. And I said, well, you know, the agent brought me here. I guess he's going to take me home. He says, well, you want to ride on the local with us back to Duval? No, I'd be afraid. So yeah, I jumped at that point.
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
So I told the agent guy that they were going to haul me home. So he went and got me dinner, and then he went home for the day. And then when the switcher got done, they took me back up to the roundhouse where they tied up. And then I hung around there for an hour or so, and then the local crew showed up. And then the brakeman, or the conductor, was Fred Deem, the guy I showed you the picture of on the helper. Well,
okay.
He saw me hanging around the roundhouse, and he wanted to know what I was doing there. And Red Griffin said, well, I told him he could ride the Duval with us. He ain't riding on my train. And of course the conductor's the boss, and I thought, oh boy, now I can't get a ride home.
Well, so what happened?
Well, they argued a bit, and then he told Red, he says, okay, if anything happens, it's on you, because I am objecting to it. And so I went up in the cab and rode all the way back to Duval. And it was pretty late. I mean, the local didn't get there till 11 o'clock or midnight.
Oh my.
And I hadn't called home or anything, you know. and so
was your mom worried about you?
And no, she knew I was with, you know, railroading. So
Okay.
the worst thing, I could be cut in half laying between the tracks or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a big deal, you know.
But anyway, my dad was working on a building up in Duval in the town with a guy, and he went home for dinner, and he come back and he says, well, Alan's still not back from the railroad, so I'm guessing that he finagled a way to ride home on that train. And the other guy goes, oh no, they wouldn't do that, they have schedules to keep and stuff. And he said, well, I bet you he did. And a little bit later they heard the train whistling coming into town, and then they heard it stop and for a minute or so. Then they whistled off again, and they started accelerating out of town. And my dad looked at his cousin and said, they just dropped Alan off. He's like, I think maybe you're right. He couldn't stand it. A few days later, I come into the hardware store, and he's like, Alan, did you actually ride the train home last night? And I said, yeah, I did. And so from that point on, he nicknamed me Choo Choo Miller, and every time he'd see me, he'd call me Choo Choo Miller. But
well, I might have to emulate that at some point here, Choo Choo. That's a pretty good story.
So that's how I got my love of the railroad, and then I hired out on the Milwaukee in September of '71. I was working at a car wash down in Bellevue, and I heard that the railroad was looking for operators. And I had previously been an operator on the Burlington Northern.
Oh, you had?
I collect train orders as a hobby.
Right.
When I was 16 years old, I found my first train orders on the ground at Snohomish. And so I started collecting them ever since then.
Like, you have a collection at home that we could look at
yeah.
sometime. Okay,
and
we might need to do that.
I collect them like people collect stamps, and I got thousands of them. But anyway, I used to drive my car down to Lowell and park it, and then I would walk the railroad yards through the Milwaukee yard, the Northern Pacific yard, and the Great Northern Delta yard, looking for discarded train orders that they would throw off. And one time I went all the way out onto what they call Bridge 10, which was the drawbridge over the Snohomish River. And I saw that there was a cabin on there, so I went in and talked to the operator and told him I was collecting train orders and stuff. And then he started talking with me, and he says, well, if you like railroads so much, how come you don't go to work for one? I said, well, I'm trying to get on as a brakeman, but right now they're not hiring. And he says, well, what about being an operator? Well, even though I collected train orders, I'd never even considered hiring out in that department where I could actually copy them. So I says, yeah, that wouldn't be bad. He says, well, I'm going to test you. So he threw a blank pad of train orders over to me, and there was a phone on the wall. And he said, the dispatcher's going to put a train order out to me here in a minute or two. He says, when he does that, you grab that phone and listen in, and you copy the train order down that he dictates,
Okay.
and then we'll compare it with mine.
Okay.
So I did that, and he compared it, and the only thing I had done wrong on it, and I had left a space for it, but when he did the engine number, he said engine number 273A Able, and I knew the word Able didn't belong in that train order, and I didn't know the phonetic alphabet.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't understand what he meant by A Able.
Okay.
So I just left a blank space there because I figured if I was actually working, I would then come back to the dispatcher and say, I didn't understand what you said after the engine number, what that means. But anyway, he looked at it and he says, yeah, the only thing you missed is the A. And I said, yeah, I didn't know what A Able means.
Right.
And he said, no, it's just a way of the alphabet.
So
Able,
that way you don't
Able,
get confused.
Baker, Charlie.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and so once he explained that to me, then I understood it. And,
Yeah.
But he said, otherwise, I copied the thing perfectly. So he got on, he says, you really want to go to work? And I says, yeah. So he got on the phone, called the chief dispatcher down at King Street Station.
Oh my, yeah.
Said, you still looking for operators? He says, I got a guy that just walked in the door and he sat down and never copied an order in his life and copied one perfectly. And he says, okay, I'll tell him. And he got off the phone, he says, he wants to see you first thing tomorrow morning.
Down at King Street Station?
Down at King Street. So I went down there and they ran me through I had to go take a physical exam and get tested for color blindness and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And by the end of the day, I was hired, and then he sent me to that Bridge 10 to break in. So,
wow. Yeah.
So I broke in for 2 weeks down there under that guy, and then I found out why he was so anxious to get me hired, because he was going on vacation up to Canada, and he already had a big vacation planned, but they didn't have any spare operators, so he literally hired me to take his place. And and that was a kind of a complicated job because it was all train orders, so you had lots of train orders to copy.
Lots of trains.
When the trains were going north,
right.
The dispatcher would put out sometimes 3 orders, and one after another, and then you'd repeat all 3 of them, and he'd give you one complete time for the whole stack.
And then you do.
And then he'd tell you to clear them, and then you'd have to pull off the slow orders that went to that train. And while you're doing that, as you're clearing them up, the train is coming out alongside it because they called for you and you gave them the signal to come ahead. And so you had just about enough time to get the thing cleared, get the 8 orders stapled together, and then start putting them in the strings. Right. And about that time, you could hear the bridge rumbling. They were coming across.
Out of the bridge.
So you'd run out the door and stick the hoop up and hand up the head end ones, and then you had a little bit of time to get the cabooses set up, and then that went into a hoop that fit into a clip on the bridge, and you could just leave that one there, and then the conductor would snag it as he went by, and he'd throw off a soup ticket and a list of cars that were going over the border.
Oh,
and so the soup ticket, you would get that information and give it to the train dispatcher.
Okay.
And then the soup ticket, you had to call.
What is a soup ticket?
The soup ticket is it's a engine number, the crew, loads, empties, tons, all that information.
Okay.
So the dispatcher knows how heavy they are.
So then when you call in, it's Exeter 271A Able North at Bridge 10, and with 14 loads, 18 empties, 1,900 feet, 1,700 tons.
Right.
By at 6:37.
We didn't have footage back then. It was just loads, empties, and tons.
Load, empties, and tons.
And then I'd take the other list of cars going over the border, and I'd have to call the Great Northern depot up in Vancouver and give that information to them so that they would know what bill declaration papers and stuff to have ready for when the train
got to Vancouver. So you didn't call Blaine then?
No, I think he called Blaine with all that stuff.
Oh, okay. So then, how did you migrate from what was it BN by then?
Yeah, it just become BN. I hired out in April of 1970, so I was like a month after the merger.
Okay.
And so I made the mistake of because I had kind of a good deal going with the extra board. They kept sending me back to Bridge 10 to work, and then they would send me up to Skykomish, and I worked up there for a while.
Right.
The one I didn't like was they'd send me down to Bond Street in Everett at the pasture station, and I had to sell pasture tickets, and I didn't know how to read those tariffs and stuff. So
figure out what the fare is from here to Shelby.
Yeah, and just before the train shows up, you get a whole family comes in. They want a family plan ticket to Cucamonga someplace, and I don't know how to figure that
And
out.
you're like going.
So I'd have to call the Seattle office, and then that guy would figure it up for me and
Okay.
tell it to me. And then I had to balance a cash book at the end of the night
Right.
with the till and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So I didn't care for that side of railroading.
No.
And we had a dispatcher. They called him Alabama. He had a heavy Southern drawl.
Okay.
And he cursed a lot on the dispatcher's phone.
Well, I thought you were supposed to do that.
Yeah, you're not supposed to, but he did.
Okay.
And we had a microphone with the radio on it, and then we had a microphone that we had to announce the passenger train when it came in. It would hit the thing like a doorbell, ding dong. And I have to turn on this mic and say, your attention please, the eastbound Empire Builder is now arriving, destination for Spokane, blah, 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 all the way back to St. Paul. And then I was supposed to then shut the switch off and put the mic back up. Well, I forgot to shut the switch off one day. And it was sitting there next to the speaker box for the dispatcher. And so the dispatcher rings me up. And he's like, Everett, you get on that goddamn phone and you tell that 99 to either head in at Monroe or get down here because I got that damn 98 heading up there, full tonnage, and he's not going to be having to slow down for any damn train, and stuff. And all of a sudden the train master came running into my office, and he goes, you're broadcasting that through the whole depot, and the passengers are looking. And I shut the switch off real quick, and I'm like, oh my God.
Oh my God.
I'm so sorry. And he says, that's okay. He says, you're not as bad as the other operator that was here a while back.
Yeah.
He picked up the mic, turned it on, stuck it up to his ass and farted in it, and then went, excuse me. And they fired him.
So then how did you get from the BN, where you were having all the fun in the world, to the Milwaukee?
Well, I bid in Lester, Washington. I went up there and I worked there on the NP side.
Okay.
And
now Lester's still pretty active at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was.
Helpers still?
They didn't have helpers.
Okay.
There anymore. They just doubled the hill when they had to.
Oh, I see.
And stuff.
Would they double it all the way to Easton then?
No, I think just up to the summit, to Stampede.
What's that? Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was on third trick up there, but I couldn't get any housing. The Seattle or Tacoma City Light wouldn't allow any transfer of housing up there because they were trying to phase
They're trying to get
everything
out.
One
house at a time.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I would, on my days off, I would catch anything coming west and ride in the second unit or whatever down to Auburn Yard.
Okay.
Then in Auburn, I could catch either the Keith turn or the Kirkland turn and get a ride out to Woodinville. And then I would bail off there, and then we lived up above a restaurant tavern in Woodinville there, right across from the Lowell the Young feed mill.
So that's kind of interesting way of commuting, isn't it?
But to get back to Lester, I had to get a ride to King Street Station and then catch the Main Streeter up to Lester and get off there. And one time I fell asleep on the train. The conductor woke me up before we come to Lester, and I fell back asleep again. And by the time he came back through the cars and found me, they were heading up the hill. So he woke me up and said that they were going to drop me off at Cle Elum, where I could then catch a westbound freight back to Lester. Well, I ended up being an hour late to work, and so I had to go in on an investigation for that.
Okay.
And then another incident came up where I couldn't get a ride out to King Street and couldn't make it to work, and I knew this time I was going to get fired, so I just resigned.
Oh, okay.
And then then I hired out onto the Milwaukee a while later.
So what year was that then?
That was in like December of '70 when I resigned off the BN.
Okay.
And then I worked
for the first time. Because didn't you come back then?
No, I only worked for the BN once.
Oh, you only worked for him once?
Yeah, I had an investigation over that first incident.
Right.
But they didn't give me any time off. They just gave me a warning.
Right.
But I knew that next time.
It'd be a problem.
Yeah, I was kind of clashing with Chuck Stoneman, that was the chief dispatcher in Tacoma. And,
Oh, you were.
And
Oh.
so I knew that he wasn't very fond of me, so I figured this second one, I didn't want to have a firing on my record, so
No,
I just resigned.
I just might as well resign.
Yeah. So then I bummed around doing whatever jobs I could get, and I ended up on this car wash working pretty much minimum wage when I heard that the Milwaukee was hiring. So I would take time off and I'd drive down to Tacoma, and I went down to see Wayne Smith, the chief dispatcher. And when I first went in there, I asked him, I says, I heard that you might be hiring some operators. And he goes, I don't know where you heard that rumor. He says, we're not hiring anybody. I says, okay, well, sorry to bother you.
Yeah.
And so I left, and as I was walking down the hall, he opened the door and hollered at me.
Yeah.
He said, do you have any railroad experience? And I said, yeah, I worked about a year for BN as an operator. He says, well, come back in here.
Yeah,
so,
let's talk.
So I went in. So he told me, yeah, they were hiring, but they hadn't gotten the authority from Chicago yet to do it.
Okay.
So he says, come back. And so I came back a week later, and still nothing. Then I came back a week later again, and by this time the guys at the car wash were, telling me, oh, they're just stringing you along, they're not going to hire you. But the third time I went in there, he went ahead and gave me a quick rules exam.
Okay.
And had me go do my physical and all that stuff.
Well, they're a little more serious when they do that.
Yeah, and then he gave me a switch key and a rule book.
Oh.
And said, wait till I hear from him. Well, I think it was the very next day I got a call about noon, and he says, yeah, I want you to go work third trick at Kittitas tonight. And he said, do you know where Kittitas is? And I had Milwaukee timetables from the time I was 14 years old.
Right.
I wrote to the public relations department, and they sent me a timetable that I literally read to death.
Oh my!
I even took it to high school and would sit there and study it in my study hall. Yeah,
exactly.
And so yeah, I knew where Kittitas was. It was just east of Ellensburg a little ways.
But you'd never been there.
But I'd never been there.
Okay.
So anyway, I left early because he said you're going to be on third trick Kittitas. So that made me think that it was an around-the-clock station like Lester was.
Right, exactly.
So I thought, okay, I don't know anything about the layout there, so I'll leave early, and then the second trick operator will have about an hour to get me.
Kind of explain what's going on.
Yeah, what the deal is. So I get over there early, and the depot is all dark, and I go up to it, and the coolest thing was that it was locked with a brass heart-shaped switch lock.
Yeah.
And I had my brand new brass switch key that the chief gave me. So I unlocked the lock and went in, and sat down at the desk, put the headphone on, and got on the scissors phone and called up the dispatcher. And I asked him, I says, yeah, this is Kittitas. I said, is the second trick operator out to lunch or something? And he says, there's no second trick there. And I said, well, do you have the phone number for the agent? And he said, well, there's no agent in town either. He says, all there is a third trick. And I said, well, that's going to be me at midnight. And I said, I was hoping to come in and break in a little bit before I started.
A little bit, yeah.
He says, all it is a train order OS job. So that took the pressure off right there. There was nothing really to do other than copy train orders and report the trains by. And
the substation was still running. They're still running.
Yeah, the substation was still going. They were running an occasional electric a couple times a month.
Yeah.
And they only had the one box cab set was all they had.
E39 or something?
E39, E47 set, yeah.
E39, E47.
Yeah, I think it was like the E39 A, C, D, and then the E47A on the other end, where the E39B had gone tits up or whatever,
It bit the dust.
Yeah.
So they put the 47.
And so the dispatcher said, yeah, well, come, your shift don't start till midnight, so come back on then. Okay. And
well, did they run so much traffic at night that they needed a...
Yeah, what it was is they had closed Beverly and they'd closed Kittitas as agencies.
Okay.
And now most of their trains were running in the evenings, and their trains were having to stop and copy train orders to change meets because one train would fall down or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, when they do that, a conductor gets 100 miles for copying a train order. That's a day's pay.
So they didn't really like that idea. And
Yeah,
you're doing it
and
like at a telephone booth or something.
Yeah,
aren't
they
you?
have to stop at a line side phone and get on there and then copy a train order and,
Okay, okay.
and stuff. And so he gets a day's pay for that. The operator that gets screwed out of his work gets 2-hour call. And you had to fight tooth and nail to get those 2 hours out of the railroad, I tell you. And I thought, I bet that conductor didn't have to fight to get his 100 miles. But,
Nope, I imagine not.
But anyway, so my first night, they put a train order out. And
Okay.
so
Do you still have a copy of it?
I do, yes,
Oh,
I do.
you do? Oh, that's outstanding. Well, you like to collect train orders, as I recall.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I have a copy of, in fact, I ended up copying 2 orders that night for
Did
the
you?
same train.
Okay.
I copied an order, and around 2 o'clock, 2 a.m., he rang me up and told me to
Want to make sure you were there.
put the board out, so I did, and he starts putting the train order out, and I repeated it back, and he completed it. And then a little bit later, he called me up and told me to go ahead and clear them. So I went ahead and made out a clearance and
Right.
read that to him, and then he okayed it. And so I put the orders together and stuck them out in the hoop rack.
Right.
And then
Was it westbound or eastbound?
it was an eastbound,
Okay.
and it came out of Ellensburg. And as soon as it came through Ellensburg, I could see the headlight because it's absolutely straight track
yeah,
all the way.
Straight and flat. Yeah.
So I got on the phone and told the dispatcher that the eastbound was out of Ellensburg. And all of a sudden he goes, all right, 19 East, I want to put another order out to him. So that meant I had to run out, get the orders out of the rack, bring them in, undo them, and tear the clearance off and bust the clearance,
Bust the clearance. Yeah.
and then copy another order. And so he starts putting this train order out to me.
Yeah.
And I'm watching this light getting closer and closer. And finally, I broke the dispatcher because he stopped in the middle of a train order and took a call from Avery, Idaho for a train coming off the Rocky Mountain Division.
Okay.
And you're not supposed to break in a train order. Train orders are priority. You know?
Right. Well, and especially you got a train approaching.
Yeah.
And he's got to stop.
Yeah,
You
and he's
don't have it
taking
ready.
forever to put this order out. And so
Yeah.
I told him, I said, you might want to call this train and tell them to be prepared to stop here because I'm not going to have these orders out in time, and he's getting close. So on the Milwaukee, when they dial up their radio tower, you could hear it over the dispatcher's phone,
Okay.
the radio conversation. And he tells the train, he says, yeah, you better be prepared to stop there at Kittitas because the operator hasn't got your orders ready yet. And I thought, the dispatcher hasn't finished putting them out yet.
So now the crew's blaming you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when they did stop, the engineer, his name was Gilly Jacobs, and he come in the depot and he saw me and he says, oh, we got a greenhorn here tonight. And I says, I'm no greenie. I says, I've worked for the Burlington Northern for a while. Oh, well, how fast can you hoop them up? I says, 60. 60, huh? All right.
Oh, yeah. Like a Sky Call. Yeah. Some of those places.
So he
yeah.
grabs his orders and heads on out the door, gets in the engine, whistles off, and takes off. And I tell you, that caboose was probably doing 60 miles an hour when it went past the depot. And I had to hand up to him because the platform lights wouldn't work. So the platform was dark.
Yeah.
So I stood in front of the bay window to have a little bit of light so, the conductor could see me.
Where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought, if I miss this,
Oh, God.
after bragging to the engineer, I might as well resign tonight because
Yeah.
I'll never live it down. I know that engineer ain't never gonna let me live that down.
No. So, but you got it.
But
to
he
the
snagged them, yep. And
Okay.
so I got through that first night, and after that it was a piece of cake. But anyway, so I worked at Kittitas for just 2 nights. Then I went to Beverly,
Okay.
and the same thing, same night shift thing. And it was funny because your hours was midnight till 9 in the morning, and at between 4 and 5 a.m. you had a 1-hour lunch break. Now where the heck are you going to get anything to eat at 4 a.m. out in the middle of Beverly?
Yeah.
So it was just a way of keeping us on duty for 9 hours and paying us for 8 is basically what it was.
Exactly.
And then when I was at Beverly for about a month, I think.
Okay.
And then when I finished that tour of duty, then they sent me to St. Mary's, Idaho.
Oh my. Yeah.
And so I went there to first relieve the agent there for a couple of weeks, and then I relieved the second trick operator for another 2 weeks or so. So I was there about 4 weeks, and I learned a lot there. In fact, I learned how to run it. The gal that was on the third trick, she taught me how to run the teletype and stuff.
Oh yeah.
You know, how to code it and that kind of stuff.
It's like a tape, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's just a tape.
And then you.
But you have to type a certain code in so that when that tape gets fed into the machine, it brings it to life and sends it to the right places and stuff.
Because that was a pretty sophisticated form of communication.
Yeah, and you had to send the train lists and stuff on that.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah. And so anyway, so she taught me how to do the teletype, so that I knew how to do that, and I was thankful for that because it wasn't too long after that they sent me to Seattle to the relay office.
Ooh, well, things got a lot busier.
And that was up in the White Henry Stewart building.
Okay, downtown.
And it was just a one trick deal, a day shift job.
Okay.
And so when I come in there Monday, I got yards and yards of stuff on the teletype that came in over the weekend, and I got to tear all that off, and I got to sort those out into individual messages. Okay. And if they're addressed to more than one person, then I had to go into the other room where they had a Xerox machine to make copies of them. Okay. Then I had all these pigeonholes that I had to put all these messages into.
Okay.
Then when I got that all done, now I got to sit down and start sending messages that everybody's been bringing in all morning and laying on my desk.
You got to do your email replies.
Right.
Or whatever,
so the first couple nights I was there well after 5 p.m. trying to catch up, but after a couple of days I got a routine down and I was able to keep up then. And I even had to take a Western Union telegram one time.
Now, don't you get paid a little extra for doing Western Union?
I don't think so at that time.
Okay.
But
okay.
What they had is it was called a thermofax or something like that. And there was a box on the wall that lit up and started beeping.
Okay.
And I figured it out, and there was these special blanks. There were telegram blanks, but they had silver foil on the back of them.
Oh.
And I had to attach that to a drum with a couple of coil springs. And then when I had that thing in place, I pushed the send button or receive button or whatever, and this drum starts rotating, and this little wire starts burning stuff across it that turned into a message.
The original fax machine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it was pretty cool, but I only had that happen once while I was working there.
Okay.
And then Marty Gerlich, the
right.
Assistant general manager, had an office almost next door. He come in and gave me a key to the telegraph office.
All right.
So that I could get in and out of there without having people have to come unlock the door for me, you know.
Yeah.
And I always figured I was going to get sent back there, so I kept that key. I still have it. Oh. But the building's gone now. It was the White Henry Stewart building.
That's long gone.
And not long after I was there, they moved out of that and moved into what they called the Skinner building, and that's where the Milwaukee had their offices up until the end.
Corporate offices.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So then when did you actually start spending time in Cedar Falls?
Okay, I bid in the operator's job at Everett. Came up for bid.
Yeah.
And growing up on the Everett line, I couldn't resist the chance to go and work on the Everett line.
Yeah.
So I went there, and that was a job from noon till 8 p.m. And as soon as I'd get there at noon, the dispatcher would ring me up and put out the train orders over the city phone. We didn't have any direct connection to the dispatcher at that time.
Just knowing where that Everett depot is, would these be like an order for like the switch crew or something?
No, this was the orders for the Everett local.
The Everett local.
To run from Monroe Junction to Cedar Falls.
Okay.
See, they ran over the GN line to Monroe, and that was CTC, so they just had to get a signal clearance to run there.
Once they had a signal, then they could just go and do their thing.
But once they got to Monroe Junction, that was dark territory, and they had to have running orders, and then they had to have an order against the Snoqualmie, the Enumclaw job switching at Snoqualmie Falls.
Right.
He was usually done and gone back to Cedar by then, but they still had to put out orders to that effect so that the Everett local would be protected against running into them if they were still up there working.
When did that line close?
It closed in '73,
Okay.
so I was there for about a year.
All right.
And what happened was they put the Milwaukee trains on up to Bellingham.
Yes.
In September of 1970.
It was part of the merger.
Right.
Right.
And they ran via the Everett line.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it was a long circuitous route.
They would come up through Cedar and then Monroe, and then they get to Everett, and then you get on the PN at Everett. And then go up on the Great Northern to Bellingham.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And my younger brother was living in Duval, and he made friends with the conductor. The train from Bellingham would stop at Duval and go to Beans.
Ah.
And so they'd leave the train down there and they'd go up to the restaurant and eat. And so my brother started waiting for him and would go down and talk to the conductor, and the conductor would save train orders for him.
Oh,
and
there
so
you go.
my brother gave me a shoebox full of train orders for that. And boy, I tell you, they passed 26 open train order offices on that route from Tacoma to Bellingham. 26, and so you had all kinds of combinations of train orders. So it was a train order collector's dream for a while there.
What could they make it in 12 hours?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think they had 14 hours in those days.
14 hours in those days.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then they could make it.
And so anyway, when I bid in to Everett, the guy that had the job there got out of there because it was 7 days a week. You had to work call on Saturday and Sunday to handle that Bellingham train.
Ah.
And he was getting tired of not having any time off, so he bid out of there. Me, I wanted the overtime, so I bid it in. And I was only there a week that they quit running via the Everett line and started running through Woodinville, Maltby, Snohomish Junction.
NP.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that eliminated the train orders for the Milwaukee's Everett branch.
Okay.
So now I didn't have to work Sundays anymore.
Oh.
I had to work a call on Saturday because the switch engine was working and stuff. But Sunday
you had a bunch of mills in Everett that you guys were switching.
Right. And so I didn't have to be there for train orders anymore
on that Sunday.
Yeah. But they put the Everett local back on because now there was no train running via Monroe Junction, and Weyerhaeuser was shipping a lot of wood chips to Everett and stuff.
Okay.
And so they put the Everett local back on, and
that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
And so I had to copy orders for the Everett local.
But that was a Monday through Friday.
Yeah, well, Monday through Saturday. So that's why I had to be there on Saturday.
Okay, got it.
But they didn't run on Sunday, so I didn't need to be there for that. And so anyway, so that lasted about a year.
Okay.
And then Weyerhaeuser quit shipping wood chips by rail. They started shipping them by truck. And I tell you, Highway 203 was one wood chip truck after another, going both ways, empty and loaded. But anyway, so once the wood chip traffic dried up, there was no reason to run an Everett local anymore. Any freight could be routed on the Bellingham train through Woodinville. So.
Oh, okay.
So that ended my job. I lasted about a month after they pulled the Everett local off. And the last Everett local ran on February the 9th, 1973.
February 9th, 73, okay.
Yeah, they had a celebration this year down at the Duval Depot to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the last Everett local.
Did you go?
Yeah, I went down there, and some guy brought a train diesel air horn hooked up to a tank, and so at the end of the ceremony they elected me to go out there, and I had to go blow a crossing whistle.
Aww. In
the middle of the night out there. I was waiting for the Duval police to show up.
Oh man, yeah.
But yeah, so then when I lost my job in Everett in April of '73, I elected to go back on the extra board instead of bumping somebody on a permanent job.
Right.
So then that's when they sent me to Cedar Falls.
And Cedar Falls has one of the greatest drinking fountains in the world.
Yeah, there was a drinking fountain out in front of the bay window, and it ran perpetually. It just water streaming off of that thing, and you didn't have to turn anything. You just lean over and drink it.
Okay.
And it was really very tasty water. I mean, it was
right from the watershed.
Yeah, I mean, we got it before Seattle did. And that thing would run, but in the winter, it'd get so cold there, it would start freezing, and it would make ice sculptures out there. It actually got dangerous walking out on the platform. But
and it came right, we think it just came right out of a stream, because was this where the duckweed was growing?
No, that was Skykomish.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Skykomish had a perpetual fountain inside the depot.
Oh, it did.
And I don't know, but I think I might be the only living person that actually worked all three of the mountain stations. I worked Cedar Falls, I worked Skykomish, and I worked Lester. And I don't know of anybody else that can claim that.
Certainly not at this point.
But anyway, the one at Skykomish, I must have came from a creek or something, because there was duckweed growing out of the drain in the fountain.
Exactly. Now I've got another question for you. There's a station on the Milwaukee that's spelled Garcia.
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 Yeah.
Yeah, because I mentioned that to someone the other day, and he says, no, that's not how they say it on the Milwaukee. Because I said it the other way.
No, that is how they say it on the Milwaukee.
Well,
and most people...
I said Garcia.
Yeah, most people assume it as Garcia.
But it's Garcia.
And that finally made sense to me during the O.J. Simpson trial, because the lawyer was Marcia, and her name is spelled Marcia, so...
That's my mother's name.
Is it spelled that way?
Yeah, Marcia.
Yeah, well, that's where...
It's Marcia.
Yeah, and that's where I got it, so I thought, okay, Garcia, Marcia. And then there was a station over on the east end of the division in Idaho that was called Gratia, Gratia, and so poorly written, you could mistake it for Garcia.
Oh.
And so the railroad changed the name of that to Calder, I think it was.
Oh yeah, Calder.
Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't that on the line that went from Plummer to Spokane?
It was it was on the line, on the main line between St. Mary's and Avery.
Avery, there you go. I knew it was out there somewhere.
But yeah, I have some old papers that show Gratia or Gracia or whatever, however that one's pronounced. But anyway, they had to change that because of confusion.
So then you learned how to copy behind when you were working for Wild Jimmy Burns.
Yeah, Jimmy Burns, he was kind of a rangy dispatcher. He's a nice enough guy, but he would put out orders, and he'd put out like weights, and he put out something like extra 24 west has right over, extra 183 east, and wait at Cedar Falls, CEDAR, FALLS, until 12:30, and I'd type 12:30, and he'd go 12:40, 12:45, 1, not 1 p.m., you know. And so he'd think out loud with his foot on the pedal.
On the pedal, so you were like trying to change your
order. And so I already screwed the order up, and now I'm going to have to recopy it.
So you bust it and redo it then?
Yeah, but you got to call the dispatcher and tell him you bowled it. And
I typed what you first put down. And
I felt like doing that, just typing all that down and reading it back exactly the way he dictated it to me.
But you didn't.
But I thought you don't want to make an enemy of the dispatcher.
No, you sure don't.
He's your immediate boss. So.
Exactly.
So I just redid it. But then I lesson learned that when Jimmy was on putting the orders out, I copied a few words behind him to make sure that whatever he was saying is what it was going to get. So.
And this was all during the radio era, or the telephone era. There was no of this tap, tap, tap of Morse code.
Well, they still had telegraph, but they very seldom used it.
Okay.
The relay office used it, but I remember one day the dispatcher, when I was at Cedar Falls, I remember hearing MY being tapped out on the sounder.
And MY being where?
Cedar Falls.
Okay, but why is it MY?
Well, most people say it's Moncton Yard.
Okay.
But I dispute that, because it was MY from the very beginning, 1909, and there was no yard there at that time, but there was a Y. So I say that's Moncton Y.
Okay.
MY is Moncton Y.
Okay.
MY. And
How did it end up going from Moncton to Cedar Falls?
well, they changed the name to Cedar Falls, but they very seldom ever change telegraph codes.
Codes, right, because it stays just like South Bellingham was FN.
Yeah, and
Fairhaven.
Leicester was DM, Dean's Mill.
That I did not know. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, with DM for
Yeah.
Leicester.
The one that we can't figure out is Tolt on the Everett line, which is now Carnation.
Yeah.
Is J.
Oh.
I can't. I don't know of any version of Carnation's name that would
Was it ever with a J?
J. So I don't know where that ever came from. But Duval was VA.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Monroe was MR.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Snohomish was SO.
Now, did the Milwaukee have a depot in Snohomish?
It's the American Legion building on First Street.
Oh.
It was originally a drugstore.
Yeah.
Wilbur Drug. In fact, if you go out on the Avenue D bridge over the river and look up at the building, you can still see faintly paint on there that says Wilbur Drug Company on the brick. But the Milwaukee took it over as what was supposed to be a temporary depot, but like many Milwaukee projects, they never got around to building
the permanent
depot. So.
Right, yeah, they start out with good intentions, and for whatever reason.
But the Everett line's pretty lucky. I mean, Everett's still standing, Snohomish still standing, Monroe's still standing, Duval's still standing, and Carnation is still standing.
Wow.
And so the only ones we lost was Snoqualmie Falls and North Bend.
Wow. That is pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty good record.
That's a pretty good record of preservation. So then, how busy were you at Cedar Falls when you were a telegrapher there?
Well, depending on what shift you were on, like second trick shift, you had to weigh all the cars that came up from Snoqualmie Falls.
From the Weyerhaeuser mill?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So you had to weigh them, and it was a old scale, so a lot of the cars wouldn't fit, so you had to weigh them twice.
Now, how did you, just explain to the folks at home, now how do you weigh a car twice?
Okay, you inside the inside the scale house, you have a button that sounds a bell, a gong or whatever, and then you have floodlights, because you're doing this in the dark,
right,
mostly.
Right.
And so they spot, the train crew knows that the car is not going to fit on the scale, so they shove the first set of trucks out onto about the middle of the scale.
Got it.
And then they stop, and then that gives you time to balance the scale. And then
because you're balancing it by hand, just like it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a big beam, and you're
trying to get it to
you're sliding weights back and forth until it finally balances out.
Okay, got it.
And then you got a pasteboard ticket card with the bottom part is a pasteboard cardboard thing, and then on top of it is a thinner paper duplicate of it with carbon paper on the back of it. And so you slip that card into a slot on the scale, on the beam of the scale.
Okay.
And that slot has a little lever that you can take and push it, and it'll push the card over a little ways. Yeah. And you get that over there, then you grab this pistol grip and you squeeze it, and it prints out the weight off the wherever you have it balanced.
Well, oh, okay. So that way you didn't have to actually write it. It actually imprinted it.
Imprinted it into it, yeah.
All right.
Okay,
Makes
then
it more official.
Yeah, then you're done. So you signal the crew with a ding ding, and then they'll roll the other set of trucks onto the scale, and then you put the ticket in the normal way without fidgeting it back and forth, and then this time you punch the grip and it'll print the other weight right on top of it. And then you just add those two weights together when you get into the depot.
And then subtract the light weight.
And you got the total weight, and then then on the weigh bill you subtract the light weight, and then that's what you use for your charges.
So then how many cars a night were you guys weighing like this?
Oh, sometimes 10 of them or so.
Okay, coming out of the mill, so that'd be a typical 10 to 15 cars a day. It's pretty typical for that mill's output?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say around 10 at the most, but somewhere between 6 and 10 cars.
And then what about down on the Enumclaw line? Was there much business down that way?
Well, these were also some of the Enumclaw cars.
Oh, they were?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the Enumclaw job that switched to the Weyerhaeuser mill. They would come in from Enumclaw, set out their stuff, then they go down to the mill, do their work down there, and then come back up, then combine that stuff and then run it all over the scale.
Okay.
And then while I was computing up the weigh bills, they would go make the set outs. The west cars would go at the west end of the yard, and the east cars would go up to the east end of the yard and make two separate set outs, and then the mainline, whatever mainline train was elected to pick those cars up
would grab them, go in the proper direction. Because I was just going to ask you how, which way this traffic went, and was it more westbound or more eastbound?
It was mostly eastbound.
Okay.
But there was some westbound stuff that went down to like through the Southern Pacific and stuff, so that would go down through the Portland train, you know.
On the Portland train.
Yeah.
Okay.
And stuff, and back then it was fairly easy because the Enumclaw job you just have to get him orders to go back to Enumclaw and then he'd leave. But after they abandoned the Enumclaw line.
Now, what year was that?
That was in
74?
I believe around 74.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they just lost the last of the customers down there, or what?
Yeah, they didn't have the chips anymore. Like I say, they ran those by truck out of White River too.
Oh, they did. Okay.
And so the other business pretty much dried up. I think they just started hauling stuff by truck from the White River mill to the Snoqualmie Falls mill, and got it kiln dried and planed or whatever. They just did rough cutting at the Weyerhaeuser mill in Enumclaw, and then hauled their stuff up to Snoqualmie to finish it.
So there are a couple of people I want to ask you a little bit about. One of them was the roadmaster, Cecil Woodrow Gilhart.
Yeah, Cecil Gilhart.
Tell me a little bit about him.
He was a legend up there.
Was he?
He knew every inch of that track over Snoqualmie Pass.
Okay.
And he came from an old railroad family that worked for the Milwaukee Road back on lines east.
His father was Otto Gilhart. It was a section foreman on the Enumclaw line.
Right.
Okay.
And Cecil was born in either Cedar Falls or he was born at Bain on the Enumclaw line.
Oh my.
That's where his dad was section foreman.
Okay.
I found his dad's time card for his men from I think around 1913 or 1912, something like that.
Okay.
I found up in the attic, I found a bunch of time cards, and one of them was signed O. Gilhart, and so I gave that to Cecil, and that was his dad's.
We'll come back to the attic at the depot in a second, because I know there's.
Well, I used to, when I was in high school, I used to write to Cecil Gilhart.
You did.
And ask him different questions about the railroad line down there, and he would patiently write me back, and I'd get off the school bus and I had to go in the little general store there, and there's a little post office in the back, and get the mail every day.
Yeah.
And so I'd go in there and get that mail out, and there'd be a letter from Cecil Gilhart.
Oh, your heart would just
CMST, P&P, Roadmaster,
yeah.
You know, and I still have all his letters stuck away in a box somewhere, but yeah, he was very patient with me and would answer.
So one of the questions I've got, as I'm reading your narrative, is like, my headquarters were changed to Cedar Falls on the 23rd, so no mileage or deadhead for me. And then later on, you're talking about another exact date. Now, do you still have all your time records from all these places you worked over the years?
Well, what I did is the whole time I worked for the Milwaukee Road, I kept notes.
Oh, you did?
Of where I was, and then I did have expense account, and so my expense account sheet showed where I was on various days and
you've
stuff.
Kept all this?
And I kept all that stuff.
Oh my!
And then I had 2 or 3 pages of handwritten notes that I wrote down.
I would go, wow, this is a pretty good memory
and
for
so,
this far back in time.
Well, what happened is I got tired of when people would ask me questions. I thought, well, I can answer that because I have something written down about that when I worked there.
Okay.
Well, I'd have to go out and dig through all those papers and stuff to find what I was looking for. So I thought, why not sit down and make a Word document in chronological order of where I worked and when, and all the details. And so that took quite a while to do, but it turned out that I didn't plan it, but I finished it just days before my 50th anniversary of me hiring out on the Milwaukee Road.
Now that would have been that would have been
in 2021. That would have been September 1st of 2021.
My father's birthday was September 1st.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Right
So
by. Yeah.
that was the 50th anniversary, and I have the brass heart-shaped lock that was on the Kittitas Depot, because the guy who bid in Kittitas put his own private lock on the depot.
Why would
which
you do
there's
that?
Well, you tell me.
Okay, all right.
He didn't like the fact that section men or whatever could get into the depot
Use the bathroom
when he wasn't there, you know.
Yeah, make a mess.
And so there's a whole thing about that in here, but
Okay.
but anyway, so he put his own private lock on there, and then years later when the Milwaukee was shutting down, he gave me a few things that he'd collected over the years, and one of them was that lock.
Oh.
And he didn't say where it came from, but when I saw that lock, I knew.
You knew.
I knew that, okay, that's the lock that you replaced with your personal Yale lock.
Yeah.
And then you kept the brass lock. So,
Well, it was good.
so on the 50th anniversary of my hiring out, that night at midnight, I unlocked that lock with
just like you did
with my key, just like I'd done 50 years
50
prior.
years earlier. So, that is amazing. So then, there's in your narrative, you also talk about Everett Dutch Voschel.
Oh, Boschall, yeah.
Voschel. Now,
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about him.
Dutch Boschall, yeah.
Yeah.
He was a section foreman, and
Okay.
his dad was a very early section foreman at Horlick
Oh.
on the other side of Cleella.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. In fact, I have a picture of his dad and his section crew,
Yeah.
and Everett's in little short pants or whatever with his brother on the push car.
Oh. Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I first ran into Everett over in Cleella. I mean, he was in the depot talking to me one time, and he was telling me about his time in Cleella and stuff, and
Yeah.
how he one night he went up to one of the houses of ill repute and got himself a woman.
Uh-oh.
Turned out to be a schoolmate. And she was rather embarrassed because she recognized him,
Oh.
and she tried to keep her face hid from him. And he says, she didn't have anything to be embarrassed about. She showed me a good time.
Interesting. So, good old. Well, like Jack Christensen said, there was 13 tracks in Cle Elum on the NP, and of course the 14th track was where all the setouts were. So, oh my. So, what did Dutch show you about how to fix this standard clock?
Oh,
thing? What's that about?
the clock had a little telegraph
Yeah.
key underneath the clock.
Okay.
And one day the telegraph started clicking, just tick, 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 tick. And I'm looking around, and
Yeah.
Everett says, "Oh, that's the time." He'd seen Jimmy Irvin do this many times, and I don't
Irvin
even,
was one of the other telegraphers.
And what it was from the National Time Observatory. Would send out standard time every day. Now, I only remember this happening one time, so I don't know why it didn't do it every day, but it was supposed to. But
yeah.
And then Dave Sproul argues with me because I say that it happened at 12 noon, and he said it should have happened at 9 a.m. But I remember Everett said that on the last click, there was a pause. Then when it clicked again, you pushed this telegraph thing, and it would set the clock to 12 straight up.
Okay, so
The second hand and the other two hands would go straight up 12 o'clock. And now you were on.
Now you're on the right time.
Exactly.
And then everybody else would set their watches off of that standard clock then.
Yeah.
Okay, because everybody, you start the shift, everybody would go, okay, what time is it? And
Yeah.
everybody have to agree.
And
right?
so Everett explained to me what that clicking was, and then told me the exact time to push that button. And I have that too. I have that telegraph key because they left it behind when they cleaned out the depot, and I went in there one day and it was still on the wall up there, so I went out the car and got a screwdriver and took it off there.
Took it off. So, and then you worked for a whole month relieving Harry Dahl on the second trick.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, the second trick, like I say, was the busiest trick because you had
weighing cars.
You had weighing cars, and then you had the first couple of trains eastbound out of Tacoma would usually show up on your shift there.
Is that like 261, or is that the other way?
No, the other way. It'd be like 262, 264.
Okay.
And for a while they had a advanced 262, which was all priority hot stuff.
Was like the mail train or
right,
something,
and then and then you had your regular 262, and then you had 264 was like the dead freight stuff.
Okay.
And then later they changed all those numbers. It was then 200, train 200, 202, and 204.
So, was the depot at Cedar Falls haunted?
Well, according to Cliff Lind, it was.
Well, tell me about that.
I only heard this story. I wasn't there, but there was when I first started working up at Cedar Falls, they had a clerk there. He was a roadmaster's clerk.
Yeah, okay.
And he did the weighing.
Oh.
He was the weighmaster, and so he would go out and do all the weighing and stuff, and then figure the weigh bills and stuff. So the second trick operator pretty much just only had to copy train orders and do the yard check and stuff like that. And so the guy's name was Hank Lomax, and he was from Texas. In fact, I think he worked for the International Great Northern Railroad before he came to the Milwaukee.
And he had a cheery Texan accent.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
And he's the one that's telling me the story about Cliff Lind up there. And he said all of a sudden Cliff Lind just jumps up from the desk and starts yelling, "Oh my God!" And he goes running out of the office and out through the waiting room and out the door. And Hank's like, "What the hell?" And he jumps up and runs out there too, because he didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, is the building on fire or what?
Yeah. And so he runs out there too, and Cliff's out there just trembling. And he's like, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And "There's evil in there. I can feel it. There's evil." And so, okay. And so then Cliff went over and he opened the waiting room door and he kind of poked his head in there and he goes, "Yeah, most of the evil's gone now." And so he went back in, sat down, went back to work.
And then that was the end of it.
Yeah. Oh, poor Hank almost had a freaking heart attack
over that thing. Well, then you had a heart attack almost when you were up in the attic of the Cedar Falls.
Oh, the bats.
Yeah.
The
bats in the belfry, huh?
Oh, man, there was probably bat guano about that deep up there.
Oh, were they there's just holes everywhere where they would get in there?
Yeah, there were just the roof, had the old shingles on it. Those were probably the original shingles that were put on there in 1911 when they built the thing.
Yeah.
And the bats found ways in there, and so when I went up there, I could see all this bat guano and stuff in there, and I have to dig through it. I found bundles and bundles of train orders up there.
And you kept them?
From around 1927 to 1930.
Oh, my.
And so when I didn't have anything constructive to do at the depot on nights, then I would go climb up in there and fish out a bundle or two of those train orders, bring them down, and then sit there and go through them on the desk and pull out the interesting ones.
Oh, okay. So you didn't keep them all.
To add to my collection and stuff.
Okay.
And but I had to dig through the dried bat guano to get them, but there was no bats around up there. I looked, up in the rafters, and there were no bats. So I thought, this was an old bat thing, and they found a better place to live, and they're gone.
Right.
But what I didn't know is that bats migrate just like birds do.
Oh, okay.
And they were gone for the winter.
So you were up there in winter then looking for this stuff.
Yeah, and so when spring came,
yeah,
I go up there one night to get some train orders out of the thing, and in the background I heard this chirping noise, but it didn't really dawn on me for a few seconds, and then I'm like, why are there birds up here chirping? Well, I look up and it's bats. The entire, you couldn't see the roof. It was just covered with a black, what looked like a black felt, It was all these bats all huddled together up there.
And there's no lights up there, is there? Or
no, there's no lights up there, but there's lights in the freight room that
kind of
shined up there. And so I was trying to pull myself up there, and there was a pipe that went up and was nailed to one of the rafters, and I used to use that to pull myself up. Well, this time when I went to pull myself up, the nails pulled out of the wood. And that pipe came loose, and it startled the bats, and all of a sudden they just came unglued. The air was just filled with bats. I could feel their wings touching against my face, and I'm like, whoa! I turned around and I jumped straight down and I landed on top of the scales. There was
Oh.
a big Fairbanks more
Yeah.
scale built into the floor of the depot there.
Right, when they were shipping freight in the side.
Right, so I landed on the top of that wooden beam for the scale. Then I jumped again and landed on the depot floor. And then I ran out through the freight room. And as I was trying to pull the freight room door open, bats were flying out.
Oh, bats in the belfry.
And it was still daylight yet.
Oh,
you know.
it was?
Yeah, it was getting close to dark, but it was still daylight, and so all these bats were flying out, and then they were all confused.
Wondering what was going on. So now then you had a better plan when you went up there in the future then.
Yeah, after that I decided to go up there well after dark, because then they were gone.
Because they're out doing their thing.
Yeah,
at
they're
that
out
point.
hunting then, so.
Yeah.
So.
So then you worked in Kent for a while?
Yeah.
Now, Kent, I've heard different things about working in Kent. That wasn't such a great place, was it? Or how?
Well, the agent wasn't such a great guy to work for.
It wasn't his son a telegrapher there too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his son, and of course, his son could do no wrong. But
right. But nobody else could do anything right.
Nobody else could do anything right.
Yeah.
He would sit there and tell you that he was the last good man the Milwaukee Road ever hired.
Oh dear. Okay.
In fact, he had a set of shelves on the wall. It was his trophy thing. They had little things like "I'm #1" and "World's Best Agent," different little trophy things that he picked up here and there or whatever.
Because Kent would have been because Kent, you would have had the auto loader, right?
Yeah.
And that was a big industry.
Well, Kent was busy. We handled all the stuff at Andover South Center.
Oh, sure.
All that industry in there.
Sure. Yeah.
And then we handled. There was industries scattered all along the main line there.
Right.
Western Electric and
Yeah.
GE.
Yeah.
Service Center and Mueller Brass and all that stuff. And a lot of that stuff really got busy during the Alaska pipeline.
Oh,
deal.
1970, late
Yeah.
1970s.
Like NC Machinery was shipping
yeah.
stuff up to Alaska all
yeah,
the time.
Yeah.
And then we had Owens Corning there that was shipping insulation and stuff.
Ah, okay.
And so it was a busy place. And you could tell there was something wrong with Kent because all the telegraphers were young bucks, you know.
Everybody wanted out of there.
Yeah,
as
with
quick as
only
they
like
could.
a year or two of seniority, you know.
Yeah,
'cause-
and it's a nice downtown location.
Because it's the only place they could land with their seniority,
It was Kent.
and no old heads wanted to work with this guy, so they would keep sending me down there, and I finally earned his respect, and I actually ended up taking over his job when he elected to go to work for the ICC in Montana.
Oh, okay.
So they sent me down there to become the temporary agent at Kent. And so I showed up there that first morning, and Sam was there waiting for me. And
okay.
first thing he chastised me for was not parking in his space. Well, that was a capital offense back when I was an operator.
Well, exactly. Yeah, parking the boss's parking
If
place.
he came to work in the morning and some car was in his spot,
Oh, I
boy,
wouldn't
you
like
heard
that.
about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But now that he was resigning, I was to park in that hallowed space. So he insisted I go out and move my car, and put it in there before we
Where
get
it
started.
belongs.
Then he
Okay.
went over all the details of the agency, because the agency is one of the jobs I had never worked.
Oh, okay.
And
actually being the agent for that
right,
community.
yeah, I worked
Okay.
there as operators on various shifts,
Yeah,
but
telegrapher is one thing, but being the agent, you got more responsibilities.
much more responsibility.
So what are some of the more responsibilities you have then as a station agent versus just being a telegrapher? Because station agents would copy orders too sometimes, right?
Well, yeah, but at Kent they had a first trick telegrapher there,
Oh,
so the agent didn't have to copy train orders.
You were already
They kind of
busy.
changed the hours around, and there was a time when the agent was on duty on Saturday, and there was no day shift operator. So then you would have to copy orders on Saturday only. So then you had to fill out a different form, because if you handled train orders, you're only allowed to work 9 hours total for
Hours of service.
hours
rules.
of service rule.
Right.
So the rest of the week you'd fill out this non-train order form for your time.
Okay.
But on Saturday you had to fill out the special ICC form.
Because you were on
Because
duty
you're-
and
because you were handling train
You're
orders.
handling trains and stuff like
But
that.
some of the duties that you were responsible for at Kent was you had to deal with the shippers as far as what they call OS&D, which is over, short, and damaged.
Well, you never,
So-
Milwaukee Road never had any of that.
So when you had damaged shipments, you had to, I remember I had to go down to Levitt's one time and look at some of their furniture that had been damaged, and it was junk. It was made out of chipboard and stuff, and I thought, man, this is garbage furniture to start with, but I had to write it off, and stuff, and then you had to keep track of demurrage, and demurrage was the shippers had between 24 hours and 48 hours to unload a car once it's spotted, depending on how valuable that car is, as far as if it's a car that's in demand a lot.
Oh, I see. As an empty, in other words.
Yeah, like a 50-foot boxcar or something.
You needed those all the time.
Yeah.
You're always, never had enough.
Yeah, so you had a short demurrage window to unload those so we could get them back in use again.
Yeah.
And stuff. And if they went over that time, then you had to bill them per day for what they called demurrage. And so you had to keep track of that demurrage.
So it's supposed to be unloaded on Tuesday. It's still Thursday. You're not done, so I'm going to charge you for 2 days.
Right.
Okay.
And boy, I tell you, I had some big companies cry the blues when they get a bill for 2 days worth of demurrage.
Well, it was only what, $8-10 a day or something.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that much, but boy,
like millions. No.
So it's like, you know what? I'll pay it out of my pocket just so it gets paid, okay? Because I'm tired of hearing you cry.
You whine about it.
But so you had to keep track of that, and really the agent was super busy having to do all this stuff.
Right.
Now later on, after they'd gone through about 3 agents that failed, then they brought in a special clerk to do the demurrage, and another clerk to do the OS&D stuff. So that took a lot of pressure off.
I think a lot of, because the agent had to do all of those things, plus do orders on Saturdays.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be busy.
Yeah.
So then one of the stories I really enjoyed was the story about train orders at Moncton. When you spelled Moncton, Cedarfalls. How did that work? What's that all about?
Yeah, that train dispatcher, Don Lair, I just found out he passed away at the end of February this year.
Oh, no.
He was 93 years old.
93.
Lived down on Fox Island in Tacoma.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was a dispatcher that I got to know, and we went on a hike. We hiked the Enumclaw line right after they shut it down.
Wow.
Him and I and Jerry Brickschneider, the operator at Cedar Falls, the three of us, Jerry's wife drove us down to Bain and dropped us off.
Okay.
And then we hiked all the way back to Cedar Falls through the watershed, dodging patrol vehicles and stuff.
We'll talk about that in a second.
And stuff, but anyway, so Don went on that hike with me with that, and I got a picture of him and me down at Bagley Junction, holding the Bagley Junction sign, which I have now.
Oh, okay.
And anyway, and Don used to come up and visit me at Cedar Falls, and I also took him on date nail hunting. We went up and pulled brass date nails off the pass. And then he went down to the lake there, Rattlesnake Lake, and found an arrowhead.
Oh.
In like 10 minutes. And I told him, I said, I've lived here for 3 years and I walked that lake searching and I can't find one,
Really? He found an arrowhead.
But he was a rock hound, so he knew what to look for.
He knew what to look for.
And stuff. But anyway, so when I was working up there on Second Trick, I had told Don that town, was called Moncton originally and stuff. And so he knew all about that.
Right.
So when he put out the train orders for the Enumclaw job to run down to Snoqualmie Falls Mill, he would put them out as say, engine 615, run extra, Moncton, Cedarfalls, to Snoqualmie Falls, Snoqualmie Falls, and return to Moncton, Cedarfalls. And the guy at Maple Valley was listening in because the dispatcher's line was an open line.
Right.
And one day the curiosity got to him and he come on there and he says, "What are you guys doing?" He says, you put the train order out and you say one name and you spell another one.
Yeah.
what's going on there? And Don, I think he just said, "Oh, it's just a private joke between me and Alan."
Now, didn't Dave Sproul work at Maple Valley?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Is that where the Pacific Coast dispatched then, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, originally their dispatching office was in Seattle, but at some
Right.
point they moved it out to Maple Valley and
Okay.
made the operators out there become dispatchers.
Okay.
And so they were dispatchers for the Pacific Coast Railroad, but they were train order operators for the Milwaukee, because they had to copy the Milwaukee orders for trains going east from there.
Okay.
And coming west, they had to copy their own train orders. And
So the dispatcher would copy his own order and then hoop it up to the train.
at Maple Valley, yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
for
So
westbound.
did you ever work much with Dave, or have a lot of?
Yeah, I worked
interaction?
with him, but Dave didn't have he worked like a relief position there at Maple Valley.
Oh, he did.
He didn't have a regular shift, so he would relieve somebody on third trick for a couple nights, and he'd relieve somebody on second trick for a couple nights or whatever. And then I think he had one day relieving Ralph there on day shift.
Oh, okay. So compared to Kent, Cedar Falls was getting slow towards the end then, right?
Yeah,
What was going on?
well, the Everett line was just Snoqualmie Falls
Right,
anymore. The Enumclaw line was gone,
right, right.
and so there wasn't a whole lot to do up there.
Okay.
And they did start cutting back. They removed one operator, and they moved the second trick that used to be 4 to midnight was now 8 till 4 a.m. So there was a 4-hour gap when the agent went home. Then the second trick guy would come on, work his shift, then go home, and then there'd be another 4-hour gap, and then the agent would come back on in the morning.
So that's why you always had to make sure then for that gap that you turned the train order signal off.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
if you left it on, then the train what would happen when the train gets there? If the train order signals, if it was green, wouldn't you just
if
keep
the
going?
signal was on and the depot was closed, then the signal was improperly displayed, and they had to call the dispatcher and report it.
Of
And
course,
the
then whoever was
the
last one to
dispatcher
lock
would
up.
tell the train that the signal had been left on then, because there's no operator on duty. I mean, the worst thing you would do is leave the train order signal displayed in yellow or red, but that never happened. It was in green.
Yeah.
But you're supposed to turn the light off, which is actually a violation of the rules. You're supposed to leave the train order burning, even if there's nobody there, because that's a signal. And anytime a signal is out that should be displayed, that's a danger thing.
That's kind of what I thought.
But the
yeah.
Milwaukee rewrote their rules, and so
did
that
it
they
the other way.
so they could turn the train order signal off.
Okay. Now, how many train orders a day would you ever take out there? You know, you would have 1, 2, 3, 4 plus your
Well, at Cedar Falls, you would copy a round trip order for the Enumclaw job to run down to Snoqualmie and back.
Yeah,
That would just be a single train order, but he would
Run
also
extra,
get,
blah, blah, blah,
but
blah,
he'd
blah,
also
blah.
get a slow order or two
Oh, sure. You never had any of those.
for that line, and then you could copy maybe a couple 3 train orders for the main line, depending on what trains you had and if the meets were going well or not. And in the later years, there was really no places left to meet. You had Cedar Falls and you had Hyack,
Right.
and those other sightings up there were pretty much.
Rockdale.
Well, there was nothing left at Rockdale.
Rockdale.
That was just the main line through there. They had
Once they built the tunnel.
at
right?
one time they had 2 huge passing tracks there, one on each side of the main line. But
Didn't they have a roundhouse there at one time?
well, they didn't have a roundhouse. They had a turntable, and
Okay.
it was covered. So that's probably why people think it was a roundhouse.
Ah.
But it was covered because of the deep snow up there.
Right. Right.
And it was actually the turntable from Laconia
Was it?
that had originally been up on top of Snoqualmie Pass
Okay.
for turning the helpers, because the helpers had to back all the way down to Rockdale and help trains up that way, or back all the way down to Ketchless and help trains up the
That
other
way.
direction. So they needed a turntable up there, and then the Cedar Falls pasture helper would go all the way to Laconia,
Okay.
and they'd have to turn that engine so he could go back down
Go
to
back
Cedar
down.
Falls.
What's
and-
the? I'm trying to think of the name of that siding that's halfway up the hill.
Well, Garcia.
Well, there's Garcia. There's a different. No,
Well, further down towards Cedar Falls is Ragnar, and then
Ragnar.
there's
That's the one I'm trying to.
and
think
then
of.
there's Bandera
Right.
between Rockdale and Garcia.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's the one I was trying to think of.
And then there was a station up there called Minot, and
Well, I never heard of that one.
well,
Where was that?
that's a guy named Charles Minot, or no, wasn't Charles Minot. Anyway, Minot Davis, that was the guy's name.
Okay. All right.
He was a bigwig for Weyerhaeuser.
Oh, was he? Okay.
And so at Minot, what they did is they built a Weyerhaeuser connection there that was called the Snoqualmie Valley Logging Company.
Okay.
And Weyerhaeuser logged some section of up there. Years ago, there was still a bunch of trestle work for their logging railroad up there, still standing. But anyway, what they did is Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company got permission to run their own trains from the Snoqualmie Falls mill up to Minot, up on the Snoqualmie Pass.
Okay.
And so I have, in my collection, I have a train order addressed to SFL Company number 5
Oh my.
to run from Snoqualmie Falls to Cedar Falls or whatever. But anyway, so Minot was a temporary station that was up there in the 30s for this logging thing until Weyerhaeuser got that area logged out.
And then that was the end of that.
Yeah.
So then on the eastbounds, you oftentimes you'd see the same train more than once. How would that be? They'd make it halfway and then they'd have to back
Oh
in.
yeah.
What? Tell
Yeah,
me about that.
That got to be a running joke. They would reduce tonnage there because the engines would crap out.
Yeah, because they're getting old and they're
Yeah,
just not
I
as
mean, they
reliable.
started out at Tacoma with 3 good engines running, and by the time they got up to Cedar Falls, they were down to 2,
Right.
maybe 1.5.
Yeah, 1.5.
And
yeah.
and so what they would have to do then is they'd have to reduce tonnage to be able to get over the hill.
Right.
So they'd set out cars in the yard there at Cedar Falls. Well, after a fashion, they needed to get those cars moving, so they'd run a dead freight to come get those cars. So they'd
Get
show
them
up.
over the hill.
Yeah, so they'd show up there and they'd go pull the whole string, or at least most of it,
Yeah.
make a train up there, charge up the hill. Okay, well then we're supposed to send the teletype of that train list, to various stations, Othello and other stations east of us, so they know that they're getting those cars.
Okay.
Well, I'd sit down and type up the list, but I wouldn't send it because I knew better. Because like 9 times out of 10, it seemed like they'd get up the hill a ways, and then you'd hear them call the train dispatcher, and you go, here we go.
Back
Yeah,
down we
we're
go.
stalled out on the hill. I got traction motors cut out on
Yeah.
this unit, that unit, or whatever.
Right.
What should we do? And the dispatcher's, well, back down to Cedar and reduce.
Oh.
And all of a sudden, in a few minutes, the caboose would go sailing past the depot about 50 miles an hour with the train roaring down there, and then they'd cut that off and go,
Take half of them up and
Yeah,
see if they can make it work.
make a
with
cut
that.
somewhere, and then put half those cars back in the yard again. So now your list is screwed up.
Right.
So now you got to amend the list, and so it got frustrating. There was times where I would wait until I heard them go over what we called the snapper up
Yeah.
at Rockdale.
What
Which
is a snapper at Rockdale?
it was a circuit that they rode over, and it would come on to the dispatcher's phone and be like and it'd make that sound because that was a train passing that particular point.
Okay.
So that was replacing an operator up there having to OS a train.
Right.
And
Right.
let the
because
dispatcher-
You could just hear it.
Yeah, I'd let the dispatcher know that that train was at Rockdale at that point. So once they were that far, you knew they weren't going to back down to Cedar
Right. They were
Falls.
going to make it.
They
this
would
time.
double if they had to. So
Yeah. Now, Frank would tell stories about when they would be going up the hill with the electrics and they would have to back down, and the conductor's going like this. We needed more pressure. You didn't give us enough pressure.
yeah, enough power. Yeah.
Yeah, give us more power. And,
Yeah.
and he would talk about how they would get halfway up the hill, and then he'd be calling the substation operator at Hyatt,
Right.
telling him to turn the power up. And,
I used to listen to them guys because,
Yeah?
like I say, they only ran an electric about twice a month or so.
okay.
And those guys would get excited because every substation that I went into, it was so clean you could literally eat off the floors.
No.
because that's all they had to do was clean and dust and take care of the place.
Well, were you ever in the restroom in the substation?
No, I never went in the restroom. But
Okay. Did you know he painted the toilet seat with Griptol?
yeah, I heard about that. But I thought it was funny about him talking about the 4400 crawling up the wall.
Remind me.
I mean, one of those videos, he's talking about the Puget Power guys was working around the substation for some deal there, and he said one of them heard a snapping or crackling or whatever, and he said that's just the 4400 climbing the wall, and apparently the 4400 would arc over, and then it would
volts, yes.
yeah, and it would go. That was the signals. That's what controlled the automatic
system.
block signals.
Right. Okay. That's
Was 4400 volts, but it would literally get loose, I guess, and walk up the wall with an arc.
Oh, yeah, there's all kinds of hair-raising stories, as they say in static electricity.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I don't know that much about the electrics. I was never a big fan of them, so
okay.
I never really studied them. I have Noel Hawley's 2 books that he
Right.
wrote about it.
They're excellent. Yeah.
And stuff, but I would listen in to these guys on the
When they were
on the block phone, because we had the dispatcher's line, which the dispatcher used to put out train orders and
okay.
talk to the operators. Then we also had a block line that was a block phone, and these would be the phones that the train crews would have to call the dispatcher and ring him up and then copy train orders on that. And section men would call in for lineups or advice on a train, has such and such train left yet, or whatever.
Or a rail fan would bug them and they, hey, you know.
And this block phone had ring codes on it, like too long and a short and stuff like that.
One would be the substation and the other one would be the depot.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when I would hear certain ring codes, I knew that was like the Doris substation or the Kitty sub or whatever.
Kitty, yeah.
And so then I would pull my plug out and plug it into the block side and listen to the conversation. And they used to pass trains from one to another, and they would have to quote amperages and all that kind of stuff. And they would spell that stuff like we did train orders.
Oh,
so they had this own language of their own that they would
did.
use on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that was kind of fun to listen to. And
now Cedar Falls, you know, back in that period of time, you used to be you had a lot of inclement weather up there, didn't you?
oh yeah.
I mean, the idea that it would rain all the time and cold.
The wind would blow. When we lived in the substation house up there, that wind would blow for like a month.
Both directions.
For a solid month, it would just be a strong wind blowing up there, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, it would quit, and you'd wake up in the morning and go, "There's something different," and then you'd realize it's quiet. The wind stopped.
The wind has stopped.
And that wind would pick water up off Rattlesnake Lake and carry it clear up to our house.
Oh.
We'd have this, freezing below zero weather, and it would pick water up off there and blow it against the house, and the whole side of the house looked like glass because the water would freeze instantly as soon as it hit there. And all the trees along the lake would look like glass. They were all covered with ice.
Covered with ice.
And stuff. That's how bad the wind was up there. The lake froze over one time. I took my motorcycle out on it, was ratting around on there for a whole day. And we went down there, and the wind was howling, and you had to get behind stumps to get out of the wind so you could kind of like thaw out for a little bit.
Well, yeah.
But I took my coat and I unzipped it and opened it like this. I was sitting on the ice, and it just blew me right across the lake like a sailboat. And then the next day, all that ice broke up and was all pushed to one end of the lake. And I thought, geez, just a few hours ago, I was out there. On the,
yeah, glad I got back in time.
And
because I know Frank was talking about, he hooked up a resistor grid in the office, and he used that to dry out the Puget Power guys'
boots and stuff. Yeah,
exactly,
clothes.
Because everybody get all soaking wet up there.
Yeah.
So Puget Power was who supplied the substation.
Yeah. And I believe that came directly from the Snoqualmie Falls power plant there.
And so that
because in the ring codes up there was Puget Sound
Was there?
Snoqualmie Power Plant had one of those Milwaukee phones with with their own ring code.
So if they needed to crank up the power in the substation, they'd need to get a hold of the dam and tell the dam to crank up the power too, wouldn't
Well, I think that was a steady 100,000 volts that came into the substation, so that was continuous. That phone was probably for them to cut the power if something happened.
Oh, right.
Up there.
Because if stuff starts tripping out.
Yeah, say things started blowing up in the substation or something, they have cut that 100,000 to them. So I think that's what that was mainly for. I don't think they ever had any regular communications back and forth between them. It was more for emergency purposes. So now I'll tell you a story. When I lived up there, the substation was all abandoned and stuff. Right. And I used to go in there and snoop around and stuff. And one time I got brave and I climbed the ladder all the way up, and there's a series of wooden catwalks up there. And coming into the depot was the 115,000 volt from Snoqualmie Falls. Right. And once it got in the depot, it was steel bars or whatever about yay thick that carried that current. Well, I crawled up there and there was nothing humming or anything. There was no noise. Yeah. So I thought these lines are dead. Uh-oh. Yeah. And I was walking right alongside of them, and I thought, you know, if I touched that, I'm probably the first person to touch that since it was installed, and it's dead. And I was going to grab a hold of it, and something told me not to do that. Okay. So I didn't. I passed on it and just looked at all the stuff up there, and then I climbed back down. And the ladder was literally iron rungs embedded into the brickwork.
In the masonry, yeah, just like at South Clayella.
Yeah. And so anyway, then just a few weeks after that, I come out of the house one day and I noticed down at the substation there was two Puget Sound Energy trucks parked at the back of the substation with booms on them, boom buckets. So I come down and asked him what they were doing. And he says, "Oh, we're cutting 100,000 volt to the substation." So those lines were live. I would have probably been fried instantly if I'd have put my hand on that
Well,
thing.
Frank always said you always just touched it with one hand so it wouldn't go through your heart. But yeah, that's so let me ask you then, you were, you know, the railroad built through the Seattle watershed, and then Seattle City Light built a dam right there at Cedar Falls too. So then how was the relationship? You know, you were getting your power from Puget Power.
No.
No? You were getting it from City Light?
City Light, yep.
City Light supplied the power to the substation.
City Light made an offer that Milwaukee Road couldn't refuse.
Really?
They were the ones pushing to get the station name changed to Cedar Falls.
Okay.
Milwaukee didn't like two-word station names. They had a criteria for station names to keep them simple so they wouldn't be confused with other stations. Okay. And they were happy with the name Moncton. And City Light had always called that the Cedar Falls plant, so they wanted the station named Cedar Falls, and the railroad didn't want to change it. So they made them an offer they couldn't refuse.
They gave them cheap power.
They supplied power to the depot and power to the town, the railroad town.
Okay, but not the substation.
And well, there was no substation then.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is 1912.
This is 1912. Okay, before the electrification.
Right. And so they made a deal that we'll supply your employees with power to their houses and power to the depot, and we will make you a big, nice sign for each end of your depot that's all lit up. Yeah. And you can use this as a, you know, publicity thing.
Okay, but then you need to name it Cedar Falls.
Yeah, and so the railroad agreed to it with that deal. And so we were on Seattle City Light and City Light Water also. Okay. And when we first moved up there, when I got my first bill, I drove down to Seattle City Light to pay my bill, and they didn't want to take my money because of my address. They said, "Well, you live in North Bend. You're not on Seattle City Light." And I said, "Yes, I am, ma'am. I get the power before you get it." I live right at the source.
Yeah, right at the dam site.
And I had to dang near twist her arm to get her to take my money because
oh my gosh, all $5 or whatever it was.
well, we had cable TV up there for $2 a month.
Oh my.
And some guy that worked for Seattle City Light built a cable tower up there somewhere on a hill and ran it down into the thing but the only problem was when the cable would go out because of a storm or something, it was weeks before you got it back on again because he would have to hike all the way up there and assess what was damaged, what he's going to need, and then come back down, order the parts, and then when the parts come in, then he's got to go up there and repair it.
So yeah, there'd be a period of time when you're not watching TV.
But for $2 a month, we couldn't complain.
Oh, you couldn't complain much at all.
But we could only get like 3 channels, I think, was all that cable would pull in. But
so, but the relationship between the railroad and the city light, how did you guys really get along all that well?
The city of Seattle fought the Milwaukee Road even going through there. They did not want them through there. But,
really? Okay.
But I think because of the way it was surveyed down off Snoqualmie Pass, they had no alternative to go.
That was the only available.
Yeah, unless they came down somewhere and came into North Bend and went down the Everett branch or something to try and get to Tacoma.
Yeah.
But anyway, Seattle fought it, but because of the right of eminent domain and all that stuff,
railroads can do.
The railroad got through there, but it was much to the frustration of the water department, and they were highly overprotective of their territory up there. We always called it the sportsman's club for the Seattle elites.
Oh, well,
you know, the Seattle City fathers could come up there and they could fish, they could hunt, they could do whatever they wanted up there. And if you just got caught walking around in it, I mean, I was out there getting date nails one time, and one of the City Light, what we call the Nazi watershed police, caught me and come up there, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I says, "I'm getting date nails out of these old ties." And he says, "Well, you can't be here." And I says, "Yeah, I can." I says, "I'm a railroad employee. I come down here all the time." And he says, "You are within the confines of the Seattle watershed."
Yeah.
I says, "I know that too, but I'm on the railroad property." "Doesn't matter. This is all watershed property. You can't be down here unless you're on duty, working." And I says, "Oh, okay." He said, "Now, you need to leave immediately or I'm going to have a King County Sheriff up here to arrest you."
While you're on your own property?
While I'm on the railroad property.
Yeah.
And
well, how did that make you feel?
I was pissed by that point.
And you got.
I mean, he's threatening me with arrest. He could I was willing to just go, but he had to throw that in that I have the power to arrest you. If you want to dilly-dally around here or question me. And so
you got even. So
I was allowed to come down and check the yard at night and walk on that same property, no big problem. So what I started doing, just in honor of him, was whenever I had to walk down to the end of that yard and check cars, at whatever point I was closest to the Cedar River, I would unzip my fly and piss on the ground right there. Just for him.
Just for him.
And boy, I went up to a couple of years in a row. I went up there for their what they call the Railroad Treasure Tour.
Yeah.
The railroad's a treasure now because it's gone, so we can talk nicely about it.
But this certainly wasn't the case back in the day.
And so anyway, I was telling them stories about living up there, and I told them about the watershed Nazi that threatened to arrest me down there in my own yard. And I told them that after that I would piss on the ground at the closest point to the Cedar River, and that poor tour guide just about cringed. I think he wanted to throw up because he probably drank some Cedar River water.
Oh man, I bet you got some other good stories from up there too, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, talking about that wind.
Yeah.
The windows in the depot at Cedar Falls were so old and didn't fit tight anymore.
Yeah.
And they had these green canvas curtains on the windows up there.
Okay.
And when that wind would blow, those curtains would come out away from the window at almost a 45-degree angle. That's how much wind was passing.
It was just going right through that thing.
Yeah. And then the attic, you could hear boards up there snapping and creaking and popping.
Well, that's why you had all your bat friends up there.
There was nights there that I thought the depot was going to actually blow down.
Mm.
It actually did at Beverly.
That's right.
I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about it later. And about 100-mile-an-hour gust caught the end of the depot and blew the whole overhang of the roof right off.
Well, and of course, then the famous stories about cars blowing off the Columbia River Bridge.
Yeah, I know that happened in earlier days. I've heard about that when they had wooden boxcars and stuff, that they've had a couple of times where cars blew off. But in my day, there was only that one incident that I know of where the trailers blew off.
Yeah, into the river.
Yeah, there was actually a westbound train that had crossed about an hour earlier, and he lost a couple of containers off of a flat car. But it didn't derail the flat car, and he didn't even know it happened. And when they started breaking the train down in the yard at Tacoma,
where's the loads for this?
Yeah, there was no loads on this car that was supposed to be loaded. And I was working at Tacoma Junction the day that happened.
Oh, you were? Okay.
And so I was listening in on the block phone when it was ringing back and forth up there. And I heard a guy call in and he gave some trailer numbers and to see if those were among the ones up there in the river. And sure enough, they were. And those were the two that were supposed to have been on the flat car at Tacoma. And I remember that westbound was just coming into Tacoma Junction as I was coming on duty.
Yeah.
And I watched it pass, and I remember the slave units in the middle of the train had the cowling blown off of the top of the engines. So it even blew part of the engine off of there. So there was a top roof part of a diesel engine probably still down in the Columbia River there somewhere.
So then you found a bunch of artifacts in the Cedar Falls Depot at some point, right? I'm thinking things like the porcelain Western Union sign.
Oh yeah, there was one up there that still had the shipping tag on it.
Oh, it did?
Yeah, it never got put on the depot. There was one on the depot, and I guess they just didn't need it, so somebody threw it up there in the attic, and so I still have that.
I was going to ask
But I lost the shipping tag on it somewhere. It's not there anymore. I think the string is still there, but the tag is gone, seems to be gone. But yeah, I got a brass light fixture too that probably hung in the waiting room of the depot, and then I have what I'm told is extremely rare coffee cup that is Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound dinnerware from the Olympian pasture train from the diner. And I was told when I went to a railroad swap meet one time, and these guys were selling platters from the CM and PS, or they had them on display. They were collectors. And I told them about this coffee cup I had, and the guy steps back a couple steps. He goes, "Oh my God," he says, "I think you might have the only cup that's in existence."
The only one left.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And but I found this box up there in the attic of the depot that I think had belonged to a boomer operator that left it behind, and they just stuck it up there because it had that coffee cup in it, and it had it had a checker set.
Okay. Oh, really?
Yeah, with the white and black round checkers, and then the checkerboard and stuff. And they used to play checkers on the telegraph for things to do on slow nights.
Now, how would you do that?
They numbered the board,
okay,
and then they'd set up a board at each end, and then they'd telegraph their moves back and forth and play checkers with somebody miles and miles away.
At a different station that happened to be open at that time of night?
Yeah.
Didn't have
things were slow, so they'd engage in a checkers game over the telegraph.
So then, so you were there, what, 3 or 4 different times at Cedar Falls?
Yeah, I was there at least probably a half a dozen different times. I was there, I bid a permanent job in there on the second trick.
Okay.
The regular second trick operator, he elected to go to the extra board, so he gave the job up. So then I bid it in, and then found out that it came with a company house. So I got the middle substation house and got to live in that. But I was only there for about 2 months, and then they pulled that job off.
Oh, okay.
So then I had to go to Kent, and
oh, right, the Reign of Terror.
And well, I had to keep going back to Kent. I tried to go to Cedar Falls, and I'd relieve up there as much as I could because I lived there. I could walk to work, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas at Kent, I had to commute over Tiger Mountain in the winter and stuff, and drive all that way down there. But I ended up at Kent because we merged with the clerks union.
Yeah.
The operators and the clerks were separate, and they merged us together into one big seniority list.
Right.
Well, then they adopted the clerks.
BN did the same thing about the same time, didn't they?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And they adopted the clerks' schedule and rules.
Okay.
And so the clerks did not have an extra board. And I was on the extra board, and I was determined to stay on the extra board. It was my goal to work every open station on the Coast Division.
Oh, okay.
And I almost made it. The only one I didn't work was Chehalis. But
interesting.
But anyway, so I wanted to stay on the extra board.
Yeah.
Well, under the clerk's agreement, there was no extra board.
Okay.
And so one day I get a call from union representative, and he's telling me that I'm going to have to go to St. Mary's, Idaho, and cover a job there.
Okay.
Because what they did on the operators, they'd bid on a job like Kent or something, and if nobody bid on it, they'd put it up for bid again next month.
Right.
And if nobody bid on it, they'd put it up again,
That's
and
all
put
you
it up
can do.
again, and
Yeah.
put it up again, until somebody finally bid it in.
Right.
Well, the clerks, they'd only put the job up for 1 month, and if nobody bid on it, then the oldest furloughed employee, which is what the extra board now was called furloughed employees.
Okay.
The oldest furloughed employee had to protect that job or lose his rights,
Oh. That
which
kinda screws
to
things
me
up.
was a screwed up deal, because if I was the oldest furloughed employee and I wanted that job, I would have bid it in.
Exactly.
So if you're going to force somebody to take it, take the lowest furloughed guy and make him protect it.
Exactly. Right.
You know,
So, yeah.
don't ruin me. I got a good deal going. So I couldn't stay on the extra board anymore. So I thought, I'm not going to St. Mary's, Idaho. My wife isn't going to move to Idaho. I know that.
Right. Right.
So I grabbed the bulletin off the clipboard off the wall and started thumbing through to see what was open. And there was 2 positions in Kent that were up for bid at that time, and
Okay.
one was third trick and one was second. So I bid on both of them with second trick as my priority, and I got it. And so I went to Kent, but they still would call me, like the agent at Everett would specifically ask for me to come up there and relieve
'Cause you
on
with
jobs
your
at
experience,
Everett.
you knew
So
it.
yeah, so I relieved the yard clerk. So I was the yard clerk in the belt yard there at Everett.
Oh, sure.
And then I relieved up at the depot on the cashier's job and stuff like that. And so I was back and forth to Everett quite a bit. And then a temporary vacancy came up for Western Junction, so I bid
Yeah.
that in and went down there for a while.
Yeah.
And then I went up to Cedar Falls a time or two. When they put the Amtrak job on, they put 2 operators positions on, so I bid in one of those.
How long did they run Amtrak up on the?
For about a year, I think.
Really?
Finally, according to Dave Sproul, a couple of BN engineers went up there and looked at the track up on Snoqualmie Pass and pulled the Amtrak off the next day.
Yeah.
They didn't even want it to run one more trip
No.
up there.
Yeah, I was.
And they couldn't believe that it stayed on the rails this
Well,
long.
and so then they went back to Stampede Pass.
I think they went over on the GN through
that's
Wenatchee.
when they went to Wenatchee.
Yeah.
Okay.
And and there was also a BN drag freight that detoured over the Milwaukee too, that went back to Stampede Pass.
And then they would, after the shutdown, they would run up to serve the mill. The BN would out of Black River, wouldn't they?
Right.
Run up
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
Snoqualmie and serve the mill until the mill closed,
Yeah.
which was, what would that have been? 80, 81, 82?
No, it was for several more years.
Oh, it was longer than that.
Yeah, I would guess probably into the 90s maybe.
Oh, that long?
Yeah.
Oh, my. Oh, interesting. Let's take a break for a minute.
Okay.
Okay? How you coming?
Doing good. Almost burned through an entire battery.